wizard goes boom. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about paradigm shifts in the world of D&D in the early 80s and dice fudging. Now, the two don't seem very related, but they kind of are, and I'll get into that in just a minute. Back around 1981, with the release of Tom Moldvay's basic set, the book gave clear examples of play, and in those examples of play, there were character deaths. And with that, it was just a part of the game. Character death happened. But in the next iteration of the basic set, this time by Frank Metzer in 1983, Frank Metzer clearly gives an example of what we call dice fudging, where in an attempt to keep the game moving along and to avoid player death, a roll is taken, an attack roll, or actually damage roll, and it instructs the DM to ignore the results of the roll where the player only had 3 hit points left, so only do 2 points of damage rather than the 3 that was rolled. That's a huge deviation from where Tom Moldvay was giving advice where characters were dying, to Frank Metzer only 2 years later saying, well, you got to keep the story going, even if it means fudging the dice. And what's dice fudging? Well, in that example Frank Metzer gave, dice fudging is when you roll the dice, but you're pretty much ignoring what the dice say. You pretend they say something else. And normally it's done in an effort to help the players. So in that example, a character has 3 hit points left, damage is rolled by a monster, and it turns up 3. So that would put the player character at 0 hit points, which back in old school was death. So the Dungeon Master is instructed at that point to roll it a 2 instead of the 3 that it was. So the character is down 1 hit point and the game can continue. That's dice fudging. I'll get into dice fudging more in just a bit. But first I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened. What happened between 1981 and 1983? Well, it's important to note that at this point, Gary Gygax wasn't really in control of TSR at the time. He didn't regain control until a little bit later, 1984, 1985. And it was the Bloom Brothers that were running the show. And I think the Bloom Brothers wanted to capitalize on selling more adventures and more story-based games. Whereas previous to 1983, we could look at the Moldvay basic set, and with that came Keep on the Borderlands, which, as we know, was pretty story light and actually didn't have much of a story to it at all, other than the Caves of Chaos, but it wasn't really tied into any particular adventure in any way. It was a sandbox, and a lot of adventures prior to 1983 were basically sandboxes. Village of Hamlet is another one. And while there was GDQ, that would be Against the Giants, the Drow series, and Queen of the Demon Web Pits, that had story, but much of the individual modules within that series were sandbox-ish. Even if a little bit linear at times, but they were sandbox-ish. As we know, at that point in TSR, the chief of the old guard, that would be the Wargamers that started the whole D&D franchise, Um, Gary was over in Hollywood trying to sell the rights to get a D&D movie going, a live action D&D movie. And in 1983, we know that the D&D cartoon came out. So Gary was kind of pushed to the side to find uh, media projects for TSR, whereas the Bloom brothers were really running the show, and they were racking up debt. As we know, back around 1984 is when Dragonlance came out. And Dragonlance was very story heavy. Same thing with Ravenloft, very story heavy. And not that there's anything wrong with story heavy games, not at all. They can be plenty of fun, as we know. I love Dragonlance, to be honest. But it definitely is a change from the way things were back around 1981, before Gary Gygax got sent off to Hollywood to try to sell D&D into a live-action movie and the cartoon. Personally, I don't think Gary would have been okay with Frank Metzer putting in the basic set an example of dice fudging. He did sort of mention something that in the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide, page 110, that you can overrule the dice. And this is from Gary Gygax. You can overrule the dice at any time. That's your prerogative. That's your right as a dungeon master. But the example he gives for the context of overruling the dice is that you don't fudge the dice rolls. You take the dice as they are, as in the example he gave was damage dice. And instead of killing off the character, you apply the damage and it would probably kill off the character. But instead of killing off the character, you rule as a dungeon master to sort of fudge the situation and not the dice. You can rule that the character is unconscious or lost an arm or a leg or is blinded, got his eyes poked out or something like that, some kind of maimed. And this is a huge difference from what Frank Metzer was saying. Frank Metzer said fudge the dice. And he also said that an experienced dungeon master wouldn't even take the dice roll. They would find some way to retcon the situation. And you may be thinking, well, why is fudging the dice bad? Well, I'm kind of an old guard sort of grognard player, so I tend to view it as cheating. Oftentimes it's done with good intent, dice fudging. It's done with the intent of helping the players. So an example that Frank Metzer gave was the damage dice. So you would want to help the player, not get the player killed, by fudging the dice, and the result being less than it actually was. Now, that to me takes away player agency and amounts to a railroad. There's also the opposite reason why a dungeon master would want to fudge dice, and that's to strengthen creatures in an encounter that he kind of under-strengthened. So you might want to fudge dice in favor of the monsters or in favor of a trap, but that's poor dungeon master planning. Whereas in the other scenario, it could have been poor player planning. It could just simply have been a bad dice roll for the player, but even still, you're removing their agency by fudging the dice. Bottom line is, it's cheating. It's cheating when the players fudge their dice rolls. But usually the players fudge their dice rolls out of frustration. maybe the encounter was too overpowering. Now, certain situations I can understand. The dungeon master, for example, screwed up and he made an encounter that was impossible, and he didn't warn the players. So I can understand if the dungeon master fudges the dice rolls there, because otherwise he would TPK the whole party, and rather easily. But that's an error on the dungeon master's part. And how much sympathy should the dungeon master have for the players? If there is ample warning ahead of time that the dungeon master gave to the players, that the situation that they're going in is impossible or next to impossible, not a good situation to be in, and they still go into it, then the dice should be as rolled. If it's a TPK, it's a TPK. If the encounter was too weak, well, again, that's on the dungeon master, and then he definitely shouldn't be fudging the dice. If the encounter is too strong, gave ample warning, then all I can say is the dice are the dice. If it's a situation where, let's say, the character is doing everything right, the player's been doing everything right, and has been playing the character well, that's not a cause for dice fudging in combat, especially, or its saving throw. But one thing that can happen is what Gary suggested that I mentioned earlier, is maybe fudging the situation a little bit, but you take the dice as is. So creature deals damage to the character would otherwise be dead, but you can rule it as, hey, you're not dead, you lost an arm, you lost a leg, you're unconscious. That, I think, is much more preferable to dice fudging. Let me know your thoughts about dice fudging down in the comments, and I'd love to be able to have a discussion about it. And I appreciate everyone watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.